the most self-interested thing you can do is to be kind and generous and compassionate, because all of that comes back to you. You want to create a world where you're not looking over your shoulder, where you can trust people, where you can leave your door unlocked. So the only way to do that is to model it. The only way to get that is to be that.
Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. Greetings, I'm Greg Thomas. In this week's episode, my co-host Aryeh Tepper and I converse with writers Angel Eduardo and Mónica Guzman. We explore how their professional lives intersects with their personal values regarding civic life in America and the crucial import of free speech. We also take a deep dive into pragmatic ways to have meaningful conversations in a pluralistic society across differences. Enjoy. Well, welcome to the show, Angel Eduardo and Mónica Guzman. Thank you so much for joining us here on Straight Ahead.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, good to be here.
All right. I'm joined, of course, by my co-host and partner for the Omni-American Future Project, Aryeh Tepper. And so we're going to start by asking you both a question. In some cases, we'll ask you both the same question. Some focus will be on each of you individually. But we'll start with the both of you, since you're both very keenly interested in the power and value of dialogue and communication and conversation. So how did this propensity and focus develop for each of you? And why don't we start with Mónica?
Yeah, so I started off in my career as a journalist pretty early. I became very fascinated with people. I found them to be such deep mysteries. I wanted to get my work done and my articles written really well. And sometimes that meant that I had the story in my head already and I just needed to go get the quote. And that was it. And I would show up to interview someone and they would be so much more than what that quote in my head thought they would be. And I just kept being surprised over and over again. And ended up really falling in love with that ability to be surprised, which is part and parcel of curiosity, this cognitive ability we all have. So there was that in terms of dialogue, conversation, the power of it, how you disappear into it, how people can feel heard, how you kind of connect magically and perspective starts to form and meld and mesh. And that's really important for journalism, but it's important for life. But then when everything started to get really politically polarized, sometime in the last 10 years, it's been a slow boil getting worse and worse. The critical need for dialogue across difference, particularly different worldviews, different perspectives, and the fact that the ways that we do and do not have conversations these days, mediated by technology, have put us into places where we're more likely to only interact with like-minded people, means that if we're not careful, we're going to lose those surprises and we're going to get stuck in our assumptions. And I think that's happening a lot, our stereotypes, et cetera. And so dialogue has become the thing that will save us.
Okay. Thank you. Angel?
Well, it's some of it's probably temperament. As you know, Greg, and I'm an artist, I'm a musician and a writer. I tell stories, I communicate. That's what I have a compulsion to do, right? Playing music, creating art, writing stories, taking photos, it's all communicating. So there's that sort of tendency that just is inherent. It's reflexive. I can't help it. I'm also somebody who doesn't quite fit neatly into anybody's boxes. And so I spent a lot of time being profoundly misunderstood. And I know what that feels like. And I've seen that the only real way to be understood is to understand and figure out where the discrepancy is and communicate your way through that. I also know through personal experience and also just observing the world, what happens when we don't do that, what the consequences are. I know what happens when mom and dad don't stop fighting. And the extreme of that, obviously, the opposite end on the spectrum to communication is violence. And I definitely don't want any of that. I've seen enough of that in my life too. So all of that leads me to have this need, this desire, this compulsion to communicate and to help others communicate so that we can avoid all those negative consequences and maybe get to these interesting and invigorating, beautiful places that art and music and all these other things inspire, but also just dialogue. I love debating. I love hashing ideas out. You know, that was my favorite thing to do. I noticed that whenever I went bar hopping with my friends, besides the fact that I didn't drink, I didn't enjoy being at the bars. I enjoyed the walks between bars where I'm just kind of mingling with people and talking about random things. That's just the way I am. So I want to get more of that. And I want to get less of the violence and less of the antipathy and less of the, you know, house divided falling kind of thing.
Gotcha, man. And it's great because there was reflections on both the personal dimensions and professional dimensions in your answers. So Aryeh, why don't you get in here?
Well, there's so much that one could say about everything that was just said. There's much to unpack. Perhaps a good place to start is maybe I'd love to go a little deeper into this opposition that, Monica, if I was hearing you right, you were posing between the sound of surprise and the prison of assumptions, that somehow these don't go together. So if you could flesh that out a little bit, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And boy, I love the way you put that. Very lyrical. I think that's spot on.
That's what I heard. Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, surprise can come with many emotional reactions. Sometimes we're surprised and ashamed to learn that we might be wrong, right? So when I think of that, maybe one of the most formative places where I saw that tension in my life was the thing that led me to eventually write a book about bridging the political divide, which was being in Seattle, where I live, around fellow liberal-minded folks politically, and I myself am liberal, and hearing people after the election of 2016 talk about people who voted for Trump as if, you know, they voted for a monster, so they must be monsters themselves. And what I ended up doing, which I've written about, was I was hearing the assumptions and I knew they were wrong. And so I put in some surprise and I would say, you know, my parents are Mexican immigrants who voted for Trump. And at that time in Seattle, especially, it was just like conversation stuff. You know, people look at me like, wait, who is she? Is she a threat? What is she talking about? What? But people would go, well, why? Can you tell us why? That's surprising. That doesn't conform to our expectation or our assumptions. And it became my way of doing several things, but in my heart, it became my way of representing my own parents, who I love dearly and with whom I've had the kind of dialogue where we've really come to an understanding, even despite like the enormous gulf of our political difference, which remains to this day, by the way. People always ask me, are you still talking to your friend? Yes, I am. Like every other week, there's something about the election in our little text thread. So yeah, that's a way, I guess, to flesh it out is it is very easy to get stuck in your assumptions if you live in a place where you mostly hear one perspective, and then it becomes really easy to pervert beyond recognition folks who really may not conform or hold some different view. It becomes so easy for you to all tell yourselves the stories colored by your judgments, but judgments of those other people that are not informed by actual conversation with those people. And that, right. You know, fast forward on that doesn't lead us anywhere good. You judge each other more, you engage each other less. Wait a minute, those judgments become more and more reckless. And that's where I think we are.
Well, you work, Monica, with an organization called Braver Angels. So can you share with us how working for Braver Angels aligns with your values and the values that you've been talking about that are crucial for you?
Yeah, so Braver Angels is a very large nationwide cross-partisan organization, really grounded in grassroots communities. There's about 100 chapters, we call them alliances, in cities, towns all across the country. They have to be co-led by someone who leans liberal and someone who leans conservative, which, you know, sounds impossible, but isn't. And it's sort of, there's proof there, right? And we have something like 50 offerings, workshops, programs that are all geared toward helping to build trust across these gigantic divides where, yes, there's a lot of actual disagreement. Absolutely, there's high stakes political issues that we need to debate, right? But you can't debate without first relating. You can't really meet to have a constructive conversation about what's best for our society if you don't even really understand where the other person's coming from or what good might exist in their ideas. So Braver Angels was formed to tackle what we call affective polarization, which is the kind of polarization not born of actual difference, but feelings, animosity, distrust. And so we believe that without building some of that trust, it's impossible to access the collective search for truth that our politics at its healthiest helps us engage in. So that's, maybe you can tell how that lines up with my values. As a journalist, the search for truth is everything. It's easy to get caught in the trap of thinking truth is about facts, just facts, that's it. And look, there's all these people not accepting the facts. Well, they must hate truth. They must not know. And that's not it, because truth is also, there's a truth in people's concerns that our society needs to tap into, constantly converse about. Because a lot of politics, a lot of these things that we need to figure out for ourselves and negotiate one era to the next. They're about facts. They're about events and what happens and what you count and choose to pay attention to, of course. But come on. They're also about what gets sparked in us around some values being violated. I don't like that. We got to talk about that. And you can't talk about values if you don't talk about concerns. And you can't release concerns if you dismiss a whole bunch of people because they don't subscribe to your narrative about what's going on.
Wow. What about you, Angel? You work for an organization called FIRE.
Yeah.
How does working with FIRE tell us about FIRE and how it aligns with, again, your values?
Sure. Well, it's all connected. I'm very much a fan of Braver Angels. I told them they're free to use my name in perpetuity at no charge. FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It is a free speech advocacy organization. The E in FIRE used to be for education, and it was focused exclusively on campus, higher education. But it is now, we figured we didn't have enough work to do, so now we're free speech defenders across the board. And I think it's fundamental to the project that Monica just described. Without that principle of free speech and without it being fiercely defended, both in the courts and in the culture, we can't have the kind of engagement that Monica's talking about. We can't have that kind of bridge building, because if there's anything that can be learned about human nature regarding free speech, it is that in the history of humanity, everyone wants it for themselves. And the minute they get it, they want to shut everybody else up. There's a great book by Jacob Machangama called Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. And it's like reading deja vu. All the way from ancient Greece, all the way to the present day. It's all about people going, we should be free to speak. Everyone should be free to speak. The minute they have power, they go, whoa, we can't let you say that. So FIRE is all about defending, reaffirming that principle of free speech and free expression that is the vital key, the vital critical tool to doing the kind of bridge building that we're talking about. So without that, there's nothing. So I figure I might as well go right to the core of everything and start from there.
So I have a question, please. So as we're listening to these two champions of dialogue and free speech, and especially in listening to and thinking about the premises that facilitate free speech and open and constructive dialogue, Monica, you pointed to this emotional element, the necessity of recognizing emotional needs and attending to those needs, and then being able to have some of these difficult conversations. I'm wondering, however, about intellectual blocks. and intellectual blocks that are very large. So, for instance, if we're dealing with a certain variation of today's far left, which interprets human life in terms of power, and that interpretation of human life purely in terms of power is grounded in a relativistic, I think if we descend in the roots a little bit, a relativistic reading of reality, which all of human life are various contexts. We're all locked into the cave of our time, the place that we're born in, the time that we're born in, and any aspiration to the truth is a priori condemned to failure, because there is no transcending our context. There is no truth out there it's always colored by that fundamental contextual perspective. How, if you don't have that shared language and vocabulary of truth, is it possible to still have these conversations?
Well, I guess I want to explore what you mean by a shared language or vocabulary of truth. But I think what I heard you saying was that, you see some tendencies on the left to, put people in certain boxes. Like, you're qualified to talk about this, but not that. And maybe your identity sort of leads me to believe where your qualifications are, or your place in a hierarchy of power that I believe is really dominant, to the point of, I'm going to put that above thinking of you as an individual and someone with an intellectual contribution to my understanding of truth outside of your identity, or somehow transcending it. Is that right?
No, I'll clarify.
Okay.
So there is a very dominant idea that grew out of the 19th century into the 20th century called historicism, which reduces everything. If we look back at the past, if we look at the American founding, we need to, the founders weren't articulating some vision of human nature and the truth about human nature. By definition, they were landed aristocracy trying to advance their interests. Mm-hmm. And et cetera, et cetera. Whatever context that you look at in history, whatever aspiration to the truth that's being articulated, it's just a reflection of that time and place. And this is a deeper language that informs much of contemporary discourse. So that one of the forms it takes is, okay, since everything is contextual and there's only power, we have to then create a vocabulary that names those different power structures. I then put you in the box, and you are now playing role A within this power structure. And that's how I reduce you, and I don't have to listen to you, and it's all just a power game. Mm-hmm. Is that is that helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I can add very quickly, because hovering around what Aryeh is saying is a term that I think our listeners and you all will have heard of, postmodernism. Mm-hmm. So when he talked about truth being contingent, relativity, with Foucault's work, there being an emphasis on how power plays into all of life, from various angles and various situations, from prisons to any number of things that he studied. So if everything is relative, if it's contingent, it's just based on the context that you're in, how can you have a firm place to stand together for the dialogues and the conversations mm-hmm. that we all agree are essential? Mm-hmm. But so do you see,
Thank you, Greg. That was very helpful. And if I can just add one small thing, how can we, as Greg described, then Monica, when you're describing the work required to have a discussion about truth with others, if you're coming across an ideology that a priori doesn't accept the idea of truth, it makes that mission that much more difficult.
Yeah. Angel, go ahead. I think you might have a thought here. Maybe not.
So I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with someone many, many years ago now, where they were denying the existence of objective reality to the point of refusing to acknowledge that gravity exists.
Wow.
So I'm standing there outside this bar with this person, and I'm saying, no, but gravity is real. Like if I let go of this glass, it's going to hit the ground 100 times out of 100, right? And she's like, no, I just disagree. And there we were disagreeing at this impasse and not floating away into space, right? So there's like, there's a point where you have to maybe the conversation's going to go nowhere, that particular conversation. But what didn't occur to me at the time is, but hold on a second, I keep speaking English to you and you keep understanding it and then responding to me in English with the expectation that I'm going to understand it. So there is a level beneath what you're doing and talking about that you don't even recognize you have accepted as a foundation upon which you can have this idea. So that's where I would go. I would deconstruct the entire thing and say, well, there has to be something, because otherwise we wouldn't even be able to communicate this part of the idea at all. From there, you can start to maybe branch out, right? And maybe they can refuse that.
I like that.
But you need to figure out where the foundation is, right? So my thing, whenever I'm at an impasse, whenever somebody seems particularly obstinate or hostile, or maybe it's just that I'm not understanding, I'm really just not understanding what's going on here, I start asking, why am I not understanding? And I start asking them, why am I not understanding you? What's going on here that why can't we get to another part? And there has to be some answer to that. And even if that's the only place you get to that time, at least you've gotten somewhere, right? Instead of just kind of
floating around,
sort of floating in the abstract. Yeah. And becoming all fractal.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the truth about truth will always be debatable. I mean, you mentioned historicism, a term I've come across not too long ago that I think reflects how I guess a theory of how truth is constructed that I find really relevant to the way I approach this work is constructionism. And so constructionism is about how each of us, each of our minds, builds our view of the world based on the experiences we have, our reactions and the values underneath those reactions, so that two people can look at the same thing completely differently. But constructionism would say they don't look at that same thing completely differently because they're dense or nuts, but because their experience of the world has put a spotlight on different things. And then they come to this one same thing and really truly see it in different ways. Different things are highlighted or spotlighted for them. So when it comes to those two people looking for truth, right, a mistake would be to think that they have the monopoly on it. According to constructionism, constructionism would say there are, how many people are in the world? 6, 7 billion? I don't know.
Almost 8 billion, I think.
Right. There are 8 billion different lenses, human lenses on this world. There's no way any one of us can access all 8 billion at once. But maybe if you explore and collect some understandings of a different lens, a different lens, a different lens, a different lens, you layer those within your own mind, you ought to be able to access some more profound kind of truth than what you could access on your own.
Well, one of the things that I lean on in these kind of situations where you're looking at, hyper subjectivity, where, you're talking about 8 billion points of views, 8 billion subjective beings with their own, okay. But we also have, as Angel mentioned, shared language, which is an aspect of a shared culture. So culture, for me, becomes a place where, of course, you have the grounds for much contention and contestation, of course. But culture is also where you find shared meaning and values and shared traditions, shared outlooks, shared worldviews, that becomes in and of itself a foundation for the type of communication beyond difference that your book, Monica, focuses on. I never thought of it that way, how to have fearlessly curious conversations in a dangerously divided times. I thought of the book when Angel mentioned one of his points or one of his ways of transcending difference in the moment. So I was wondering, Monica, if you could share with us some of the practical techniques that might heighten our ability to communicate as democratic citizens despite the political, social, and cultural differences that I mentioned.
Yeah, well, Angel, hinted at one already. You framed it, Angel, as why am I not understanding? And that's a question. So what's great already is that you're asking a question instead of drawing a conclusion and making a judgment. Right. So just the act of pausing before a judgment to ask a question of yourself, that's sort of self-inquiry, where I've just been triggered by something someone said, or I really don't like that, then your internal reactions will say, well, get away from it, fight, flight, judge and do a thing. But just being able to say, wait, why am I not understanding? Leads your mind to wonder at the answers, which is curiosity. And curiosity can drive you toward then searching for the answers. In the book, I talk about the power of the internally directed question, what am I missing? So, and there's a lot of assumptions that we have across the political divide can be boiled down to those other people must be crazy, stupid, or evil. So the thing is, we know from research that, boy, a lot of people assume that about a very large chunk of the rest of the country. And if you just look at it coldly, it can't be true. There can't be that many stupid, crazy, evil people. It just doesn't hang on. Really? Does that really jive with our experience of human beings? Probably not. So you have to ask the question, what am I missing? There's a somatic therapist named Luis Mojica, whose work I really respect. And he poses a really interesting question, which is to wonder at this, why does this idea feel safe for you, but it doesn't feel safe for me? Is another way to turn what could be a judgment or something that would put you into a state of threat into a circumstance for inquiry, which then leads to exploration, which then leads you to open your mind. So I'll leave it at that. There's so much else, but we'll leave it there.
What advice would you give in the context I'm going to describe? So I've participated in a number of dialogue groups in Israel between Jews and Muslims, and as part of that experience, I've had discussions with the equivalent of Muslim fundamentalists. At a certain point, the purpose of the dialogue becomes highly questionable because you become to understand that I'm either going to kowtow, to mix my cultural metaphors, I'm going to kowtow to the ideology that is being presented, or I'm going to walk away. Would you have a recommendation in this context? Because this is another element that's, you do have, and you could find parallels as well, but you have increasing numbers of Muslim fundamentalists in America. Mm-hmm. You're going to have conversations with them. What would your response be? How would you approach that place when the assumption is so airtight and the position of superiority is really so locked in, and the truth of what I have to offer is can't be questioned? Where would you begin?
Well, again, the beginning of my answer is more questions. You mentioned sure. You mentioned the purpose of the conversation is off the table or something like that. I think the first thing is, what is the purpose of the conversation? Because depending on the purpose, you could or could not have paths forward. So, for example, if the purpose is to understand someone else, then no matter how confident they are or how superior they feel, understanding is always possible. And I think Angel said it earlier, maybe I missed this or I'm conflating something else, but the best way to understand, the best way to be understood is to understand. I really believe that, people can only hear when they've been heard. That's particularly difficult to try to do humbly when you feel like you're faced with someone who is so certain. I mean, certainty is the arch villain of curiosity, so certain, and has a posture that is so superior. Then it really comes back to purpose. If your purpose is to change this person's mind, I would recommend a lot of pause on that because persuasion doesn't work that way. To quote the author David McRaney, who I hugely respect, all persuasion is self-persuasion. Try to talk someone out of their deeply held faith. I'll hand it over to my sort of interfaith experts on that one. That's a tricky kind of truth for sure. I'll leave it there because Angel, I know you and I have had conversations about this, and you have some really good perspectives here.
Well, yeah, it depends, right? I can't help but notice the fact that the context, Aryeh, that you're talking about is a conversation. It was a formal conversation. Correct me if I'm wrong. This isn't just somebody you bumped into, right? It's everyone showed up there for the purposes of having some kind of dialogue.
In a few cases, it also segued into cups of coffee and informal conversations.
Okay.
That was the original context.
Okay, so to me, that would be the thing I would remind myself of, is that at the very least, the people I'm dealing with in this context are separated from those who wouldn't even show up to this. And that, even if it's the smallest gap between those two groups of people, there's a gap, and that gap matters. So there's that. And I think, you're pointing to a very difficult circumstance, something that is more of a, kind of maybe like a brown belt or a black belt version of what we're talking about, right? Like that's going to be really, really difficult. It's going to be much more difficult than, some coworker who you disagree with about XYZ policy, right? The stakes are higher. It can get scary. It can feel existential. It can feel even dangerous, right? Like physically, personally dangerous. So bearing all that in mind, that's important to note. But the two things that I'll say, the first is those people are fewer in number than we might think. Generally, we're unlikely to run into those kinds of people, generally speaking. There are obviously exceptions in different contexts, but that's the first thing. So there's that. And then there are success stories even in those contexts. I always talk about my hero, Daryl Davis, who he goes into the lion's den of talking to Klansmen, people who think he not only shouldn't exist, that he's subhuman, but he works on them. And the thing that Mónica says is really important, which is that be mindful of what your goals are, right? Think of how easily you can be persuaded out of your deeply held convictions in a single conversation, or even two conversations, or 5 or 10, right? How long would it really take for you to fundamentally change your mind about something that you would consider to be integral to who you are as a human being? So keep that in mind when you're trying to get through to somebody else. It's going to take time. But the thing that you can do right now, in this moment, in this conversation, is try your best to guarantee that there will be another conversation. Try your best to walk away from this conversation with both of you feeling like something interesting happened and you're interested in doing it again. That is all you need for that long-term change to happen.
I can't agree with that more. I think that's spot on. And I would also add something that I've termed for myself the afterburn of conversation. I think that we look for signals that we have made an impact on the other person. And depending on our investment in them changing something about how they see the world to more resemble our preferred perspective that they take, we're going to be sort of impatient, and we're going to, we really just want them to tell us that they see what we mean, or that they agree with at least this one thing. And we're going to see probably some resistance during a conversation to that. And as Angel said, all persuasion is self-persuasion. If you were to influence someone else's view of the world, it would take a long time. So absolutely the right strategy is if you finish this conversation able to have the next one, great. But the other thing is, you never know what happens in the conversation that person has with themselves after having interacted with you.
Yeah.
And I have heard story after story about someone who, you ask them what's something you've changed your mind about, and they dig and they find something and they go, it was because this person that I met was really different from me, told me about this thing, and it really I didn't notice it at the time, but like a week later, I realized that had really hit my heart. And like, I could give you examples of people who have shifted their thinking because of an encounter or a conversation. That other person had no idea they had an impact on that person, but they did, because every time we have a conversation with someone else, we're having two conversations, the conversation with them and the conversation with ourselves. And the conversation with ourselves doesn't stop. It continues. And we never know what seed got planted in there. So really the other strategy is, look, like, share your story, share your perspective, see if you can get to the point where that person is receiving your perspective, which can be really hard if your perspective feels threatening or just too different or so uncomfortable. That's tricky. That takes time. But I really do believe that that's the way we open each other's eyes. You know, it's less, the best argument is, here's how I see it. Here's how I see it. Here's how I just see it. Can you look at it the way I see it for just a moment? Can I tell you a story so that you can relate to my journey through this? And the way we relate is so powerful. It can bust through barriers so quickly, right? Tell a story about a time that a dilemma you faced, and you made this choice that's surprising to this other person, but they might go, well, I don't agree with his conclusion, but I understand why he did that in that situation. Because I've been in situations where I've been hurt, or blah, 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 blah. So that's it. It's like this larger thing about, let's get to the point where I can put my perspective into a place where you can see it. And I don't know what impact that's going to have. And I can't be too invested in seeing a signal in this conversation that I've changed your mind, because it doesn't work that way anyway. But that doesn't mean I didn't have an impact. So don't think you're not having an impact.
Excellent. So I wonder, Angel, how your idea of star manning might play into this. You know, there's the straw man, where you have an opponent or you have someone that you're, say, having an argument with, and you characterize their position in a very limited way. You give it the weakest aspect of their argument, or you mischaracterize what they're saying. Then there's steel manning, which is purposely and consciously presenting the strongest point of view or the strongest perspective of someone you disagree with, to be fair and to really engage seriously with what's being said. But you have an idea of star manning. What's that?
It's just a fancy name for what we've been talking about this entire time, which is just to say that so star manning is taking steel manning a step further by not just presenting the strongest version of the argument, but also the strongest version of the person making the argument. You know, who is the best possible person I can envision making this argument? And why would they make that argument? What are the fundamental human desires and values that are motivating this argument? Get to the why, because it's there, right? And very, very few people wake up in the morning and go, how can I cause the most pain and suffering today? How can I possibly do that? How can I maximize pain and suffering? Most people don't wake up like that, right? Most people are thinking, no, I'm going to go do what I got to do, or I'm going to go do what needs to get done. And what's implicit in that is I'm going to go do the right thing. I'm going to go do at the very least, the thing that is justifiable given where I'm trying to get. That's what star manning is. It's just an explicit acknowledgement before you can get to the steel man that your interlocutor is a human being with human values and human desires that you can locate and connect with as a fellow human being. Then you can properly steel man. And the impetus for star manning came about because I noticed that we don't just straw man each other's arguments, we straw man each other. We create monsters out of each other. Like Monica said earlier, you know, this person voted for this person. They must be a monster, because only a monster in my mind could conceivably behave this way. But that's the wrong answer, you know? And yeah, it's motivated by, or it's grounded in a very simple and safe assumption, which is just that most people, most of the time, are doing what they believe is good, right, and just, or at least justifiable. And that's even if they're wrong, right? Even if they're wrong, that's what they think. So that, I think that's an important thing that people stumble upon, or people stumble over, which is that there's nothing about what I'm saying that means you must acquiesce to their perspective or their argument, that you must agree with it, that you must condone it. You must only understand it and communicate to them that you understand it. And that is that is just the fundamental basis upon which you can then disagree and find some way through that disagreement.
So I see you shaking your head positively in agreement, Monica. Do you have anything to add to that characterization?
I just have to say, so David Brooks, the author, talks in his book, How to Know a Person, a category of person called a loud listener. So a loud listener is someone who's just always, yeah. I've struggled with this my entire journalism career. When I went into actual visual and audio media, people were like, Monica, stop saying yeah. Stop it. We got to hear the other person. Anyway, but yeah, that's just what I do. I'm a loud listener. But absolutely underlining everything that Angel just said, I think that part of what's going on in our society right now is we are having to dig deeper than just the mechanics and justifications and good practices of debate and argument, because it's not been enough. And so the level deeper that Angel is talking about is people. We are so broken right now in the way that we understand each other that we need to remind ourselves about people and how people work. And it's not enough to remind ourselves about good argument and good debate. Steel manning is not sufficient. We have to star man because of the gross skew of the way that we see people who disagree with us. And I don't want listeners to feel like it's all their fault. I mean, there's lots of things about our media ecosystem, our political ecosystem, the incentives in play, the communications technologies we use. It's not that we all suddenly became terrible or ignorant or whatever, or it's just that this world is a very busy one that throws a lot at us. We're busy, we're scared, we're tired. And it takes some time to adjust and make the most of the tools and the communications that are available to us without letting them subvert, us and bring out some of the worst instincts. So I think what we're doing right now in this several year chunk is sort of facing those challenges and rising as humans tend to do to learn those things we need to focus on. And that's why I think these days in these conversations, you hear a lot about dignity and humanity and remembering that people are at base not that bad. Every time you hear a disagreement, it feels like we didn't have to, at least in my lifetime, we haven't had to have that conversation so often, but we do now because of the level of brokenness.
A beautiful aspect of everything that's being said beyond the societal benefits is that whomever is going to go down this path is going to come out a richer person.
Yes.
If you're listening, you're going to be exposed to a variety of perspectives, and you'll enrich yourself along the way with those perspectives. And that's a good in and of itself,
Absolutely.
Even if nothing comes out of the conversation. That's my amen.
Yeah, I always say the most self-interested thing you can do is to be kind and generous and compassionate, because all of that comes back to you. You want to create a world where you're not looking over your shoulder, where you can trust people, where you can leave your door unlocked. So the only way to do that is to model it. The only way to get that is to be that, So it's like, if all you care about is yourself and your own well-being, you probably don't want to live in a world where everyone's out to get you, where nobody trusts you, where you can't trust anybody else, right? That seems like a terrible world to live in. So someone's got to start this machine, right? Someone's got to start it going. Someone has to be the first person on the dance floor. Yeah. So it should be you. Why not?
That's great. And it reminds me of the imperative of leadership. I mean, like you say, who's going to get on that dance floor first? So we need people to step up and stand out with these really high cultural and even spiritual principles. I mean, the plane that we're talking about, that many aspire to, but many have achieved, and some are very historical figures, we can themselves use them for ourselves to move forward. Now, in that vein and in that light, I'd like to close out with a question that we ask our guests. The Omni-American Future Project, which powers Straight Ahead, the Straight Ahead podcast, was grounded in the work of Albert Murray, the author of The Omni-Americans and many other books on American experience, history, culture, particularly through the window of blues and jazz. We ask our guests, when you hear the term or the expression Omni-Americans, what does that mean to you? And I'd like either one of you to respond, followed by the other.
I'm trying to remember my Latin prefixes. Okay, but I shouldn't ask. So, Omni-American?
No, you should.
No, I guess I should. What does Omni mean? Omni means...
Yeah, so Greg, maybe give a little...
Is it...
Oh, absolutely. Omni, when Albert Murray came up with the title, the Omni-Americans, he was thinking of all American or all Americans. But that term was used in sports, an all-American. So he wanted to come up with a term that would be kind of inclusive of America and Americans in their best light. And I'll just leave it there because I don't want to. I don't want too much shadow what you're going to say.
I'll come up with one sentence, please, which is that implicit in this is the idea that so-called Black Americans and so-called white Americans, and Murray looked beyond race to culture, character and culture, that so-called Black Americans and so-called white Americans resemble no one in the world as much as they resemble each other. So that so the omni is that deeper American reality that often isn't seen. Gotcha.
Well, what I hear is the aspiration of what some social scientists call the, it just escaped me, the mega identity. So there's this sort of fantasy that a mega identity will matter so much to different kinds of people in America that the things that divide us just won't matter so much in relation, and that therefore there'll be a stronger tendency to see what is shared and to trust and to open up and to listen, than there might be right now, where for a lot of folks, more splintered identities are just more meaningful to them. So that's what I think of when I hear Omni-American.
I agree with that. And I think of the fact that America is unique in that it is not really, it's not really a patch of land. It's not really a flag. It's not really a particular people. It is an idea. Mm-hmm. And it is almost by definition, many peoples brought together under the aegis of these ideas, these specific ideas. And for me, honestly, anybody who espouses and endorses these ideas, no matter where they live, even if they never set foot on quote unquote American soil, they are American in heart and mind and spirit. I think that's really what I think Murray was getting at. And I certainly identify with that. I am the greatest patriot you will ever find in that sense of America. And I think it's what we should all aspire to do and be. I think we're unique in that way, and it's beautiful in that way. It's powerful in that way. America's everybody.
Hear, hear.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us here on Straight Ahead. We appreciate your time and your ideas and your passion and your heart and souls. And we hope that our audience will take away some of the insights that you shared with us regarding communication, dialogue, and conversation, and how to move beyond many of the things that keep us divided. We can be different. That doesn't mean we have to be divided.
That's right. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.